Hi, Dr. Scott Jensen here. Let me just start right from the beginning. Thank you. Thank you so much for following my travails with the Board of Medical Practice in Minnesota. I would say this. I've asked myself over and over again, why was I sitting before the Board of Medical Practice today? And I think part of it might be because I'm naturally a skeptic, but quite frankly, medical school teaches you to be skeptical. I think it's important to me that context always be appreciated, because without context, I don't think we can really grasp what we're dealing with. And I think as a sitting senator and vice chair of the Health and Human Services Committee, I had access to information that not everybody gets. I certainly had access to what was happening as the Department of Health and the CDC was turning our lives upside down. But I think also, I took my responsibility seriously. I did my due diligence. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that I spent 2,000 hours dealing with Minnesota Board of Medical Practice complaints over the last 3 years. But in the end, I think the reason I sat today before the Board of Medical Practice was because of the verse in Luke 12:48. From whom much is given, much is demanded. But from whom much is entrusted, even more will be asked. I think I was entrusted to be a voice for more than Scott Jensen, to be a voice for more than just the providers, the nurses, the first responders across the Minnesota borders. I was asked to be a voice this time around for the entire planet. We all saw things that we did not think we would ever see. I was entrusted to do something that if I had been asked at the front end, I might have said, gee whiz, I'd like to take a pass. But I didn't have that opportunity. I wore the tie Starry Night by Van Gogh because when I think of my brother's suicide and I think of all the voices that don't have a chance to see justice served, that's why I'm here today. And today, justice was served. All 18 allegations were dismissed outright. Investigations are done. A splendid result. Do you remember 3 years ago when I first announced my first investigation? Take a look. Less than a week ago, I was notified by the Board of Medical Practice in Minnesota that I was being investigated because of public statements I had made. They listed 2 allegations. They said I've been spreading misinformation in regards to the completion of death certificates on a news program, which happened to take place on April 7th. And you could find that one. It was with Chris Berg if you wanted to. And the other allegation was that I provided reckless advice in my willingness to compare COVID-19 and the flu. When I got this letter, I was ticked. And quite frankly, I leaned into the comfort and wisdom of my family to help them, let them talk me off the cliff. But doggone it, if this can happen to me, my view is it could happen to anybody. I want to say something about the substance of the hearing, but I want to be respectful. I thanked the individual members of the Minnesota Board of Medical Practice for the work they do. When I speak of the board being weaponized, I'm not talking about the individuals, I'm talking about the agency. I'm talking about the fact that there are people out there that if they didn't like my narrative or my comments, they wanted to shut me down. Too bad for you. You picked the wrong guy. The Minnesota Board of Medical Practice participated in an honest, open discussion with me. We talked about a lot of different things. Parts of the conversation that I will remember for a long, long time will be when we talked about misinformation versus disinformation. When we talk about being entrusted with the responsibility to serve the public. Those are things that I'll remember. We talked for an hour and a half. I'll remember a lot, and I want to be respectful. But in the final analysis, the Minnesota Board of Medical Practice said, Scott Jensen, your license is unrestricted. These allegations are dismissed. I'm very glad that this time around I went out and got a lawyer. I interviewed several, and I asked Mr. Greg Joseph to stand with me. And he's going to make a comment or two in a moment. But I want to share one thing that he said to me very early on. He said, Scott, you're in a snowball fight, and you're trying to make the perfect snowball so you can win the snowball fight. There should be no snowball fight. That was a dimension of perspective that had been lacking. But we know it now. There should be no snowball fight when someone is simply giving their best information, trying to serve the public, and exercising his First Amendment rights. So I'd like to introduce Mr. Greg Joseph, my attorney, and see if he'd make a few comments.
Sure.
Thanks, Greg.
Thanks, Scott. Yeah. Thanks. We're obviously still waiting on formal notification from the board, and we don't have the paperwork from the Complaint Review Committee just yet, but as you mentioned, all 18 were dismissed, and rightfully so, so justice was served. But the question we don't have an answer to yet is where exactly the line is drawn between conduct, in terms of professional conduct as a practicing physician, and speech, which the conduct doesn't, the board doesn't get to regulate, the government doesn't get to regulate your right to speak freely about things you know about. And that question hasn't been answered yet. So we'll see. But today, time for celebration, the board did the right thing.
Thank you. Thanks, Greg.
Thanks.
In closing, I would just like to say one other thing did come up. And it was the fact that when my father died, he gave me a copy of the Desiderata. And I shared a few phrases from that with the board. And one of the phrases I shared was, in the noisy midst and the chaos that we lived in during COVID-19, we need to keep our wits about us. We need to see the goodness in life around us. We need to remember the words of Hebrews 4:14, hold fast to the beliefs you profess. I honestly believe that I was entrusted to be a voice for many more than I'll ever know, and that the words of Esther 4:14 speak to all of us for such a time as this. Thanks for being willing partners standing side by side with us through this adventure. Thank you.